Not many players know that there is a way to defeat the London system in 10 moves in the most commonly played line. We're heading to the Leech's database of games to show you that it's not clickbait, it's a real deal. Now, against the first queen spawn move pawn d4, I recommend that you respond with knight f6, not d5. Now, if you go d5, what I dislike about this is that it gets right into the position that your opponent is aiming at, where it's really stubborn. After they play all these moves, their position is rock solid. And even as a grandmaster, while facing lower rated players, I typically want to attack them, I want to win, but against the London system, it always felt uncomfortable, and that's why I've been looking for a way to spice it up to make it more aggressive, and here's what I found. Now, against this line, I do recommend that you start off with knight f6. If you ever wish to transition back to the queen's gambit, you can always do so by playing d5 later, but quite often if they want to play the London system, they'll start with bishop f4. And your idea here is that you want to undermine this central pyramid of pawns, because that cements the position and allows white to enjoy a very comfortable and safe environment, so to say. So we do that by playing pawn to c5 moves straight away, and we start attacking this pawn chain right out of the gate. Now, in most cases, your opponents are going to play pawn e3. We'll talk about other alternatives later in the video. e3, in fact, is the best move, because the alternative, c3, is slightly inferior, because in some variations of e3, white may decide to change their mind, and instead of going c3, they may actually develop their knight to c3, and sometimes even try to jump somewhere over there. Therefore, e3 is more flexible and is actually considered to be the best move, and it's also the most played move. Here, you can see in the lower right corner, like the stats, and the top line is shown at the top, the most played line. Now we trade right there because our goal is to destroy this pawn barrier in the middle of the board, and after this you kind of switch to the King's Indian defense. So to say, it's not exactly the King's Indian already, but nevertheless, you go pawn d6, which also shuts down their main hope. Their hope was for you to play d5 at some point. Now their bishop is active. In the future they can always lend their knight to e5 to this juicy square, and again they enjoy this very solid and fixed position. Instead we play d6, and our long-term idea is to actually attack them in the center with move pawn e5 with this central break. Now we're going to prepare it, of course. Now again, let's just follow the most played line. c3, we go g6, we want to encounter our bishop. After this they make their typical London setup, knight d2, knight c6, now they castle, and here comes the moment of truth. We'll hit them hard with this central break pawn e5. And initially it looks like a miscalculation, because if we count attackers, there are 3 attackers to this square, and black has 2 defenders. It looks like you miscalculated. And that is the reason why the most played move by white is pawn takes e5, which is in fact a tactical blunder. After you recapture, now look at this, 10 moves in the game, and if I turn on Stockfish, what does it tell us? It's minus 3.5, 3.3 for black. Why? Because we attacked this bishop, but what white overlooked is that we also have a discovered attack to this bishop on d3, which means that there is no way for white to hold on to both of these pieces, and you're going to win them right on the next move. So for example, they take right here, you recapture, white takes, now queen takes d3, we grab this juicy bishop, and the beauty of this position is not only you're a piece up, but also the position is very simple. White does not have any attack whatsoever, plus thanks to this queen putting pressure, most likely white will have to accept an exchange of queens, and then you'll get to a completely dull position where you're just a piece up and it's easily winning. Just to, again, to continue the line, you don't have to remember it, but just to show you what could be the continuation of the game. If, let's say we still just follow the most played line, knight f3, trade off queens. After that you can go bishop g4, and if you wish to you can also trade off this knight. Again, it leads to a very simple dry position with you just enjoying your extra piece and an easily winning endgame. Now I'm going to answer different what ifs so that you have a complete overview of how you can crush the London system. Now, getting back to our most crucial position of the main line, what if white does not take on e5 and does not fall for the trap? Well, then they'll need to move their bishop. And the most natural square for the bishop to go to would be g5, trying to at least spin your knight. What do you do then? Well, there are different ways to go about this, but the easiest is just to continue your main strategy, to just destroy this pawn chain, and you can actually take it forcing them to have a weak pawn on d4 if they were captured by a pawn. If they were captured with a knight, you can continue trading, making sure that at the end of the day, they have that weakness on d4. Now notice that, unlike the main line of the London system, here they do not have any pawns on adjacent files, meaning that pawn on d4 is actually weak. And you can play queen b6, which again is a very common idea to counter the London system. This queen b6 move, which instantly counters the pawn on d4, as well as the pawn on b2, and already makes it quite uncomfortable for white to deal with these threats. For example, if they go knight b3 and want to cover up that way, you can continue with bishop e6, putting some pressure to this knight, and therefore indirectly to that pawn on d4. You can play a5, a4 maybe, and also kick the knights that way. Either way, it's gonna be an uphill battle for white, and it's already quite annoying, and for the most part, you just destroy their system altogether. Going back a couple moves, in most cases your opponent will develop their bishop to d3 because that's a part of their traditional London setup. However, what if they put the bishop, let's say, to e2, so that after we reach this middle game position, there is no central break with pawn e5. So if you play right away, in this case, without the bishop on d3, that would be indeed a miscalculation because white has 3 attackers to this pawn. And yeah, you will indeed just lose a pawn, because after this trade, there is no discover attack this bishop on d3, because there is no bishop there. But the solution is pretty simple. Let's take it back. In this case, you just need to prepare the move pawn e5. And you can do this by going knight h5 first, hitting this bishop, or by going rook e8, which I like even more just for simplicity. Now we're ready to go e5 on the next move. In most cases, your opponent is going to play the move pawn h3, which is standard for London system players. When they worry about the safety of this bishop, they typically play pawn h3 so that the bishop can retreat. In this case, however, it's actually not a great idea because it allows you to execute your main attacking plan and put pressure on white. Now e5 hits the bishop, hits this pawn. After they trade, they still got to do something about the bishop. The bishop retreats to safety, that's alright, but you keep pushing in the center and you gain this space, you push this knight back. Just think about this, the knight does not have any good squares to go to. If it goes here, it's going to be simply captured because we attack this square twice with our knight and rook. If it goes here, we're also going to capture it because we attack it twice with our knight and queen. They're going to lose a pawn. If they go somewhere here, after h6, the knight is going to be trapped, which means that actually they only can move the knight all the way back to e1, to a very awkward square where it blocks the rook, and generally speaking, it's a very clumsy position for their pieces. So it's pretty clear that you achieved an edge pretty easily, right? Just with the central breakthrough with e5 and e4. I'll show you a potential game continuation. You don't have to memorize it, of course, just to show you how the game could possibly continue. Like, you've got this bishop, which is undeveloped yet. You can develop it somewhere. If, let's say, they want to bring the knight to the play, now they're just trying to untangle their pieces, but you have finalized your development, you are ready to attack. You can play queen b6, once again, very common way for black to start putting pressure on white. This time we hit this pawn. On the next move, we are ready to play a rook d8 and, put the pin onto this knight, maybe even bishop h6 and attack the knight that way. And actually white is going down, I'd say, right here. It's already quite tough for white to find the right defense. Now let's move on to the second most common variation that you need to know. White still goes for this bishop f4, the London system, and they're hoping for an easy life. They're hoping for a complete Brexit. They don't want to care about the Italian game, the Spanish game, the French defense, the Danish gambit and whatnot. They just want to play their London stuff. But we're going to put pressure and make their life harder. So we play c5 and we start attacking their center straight away. So far we talked about e3, the main move for white. The second most common attempt of white would be pawn to c3, and I'll show you in a moment how to attack them there. It's less common for white to play knight f3, even though some of your opponents may still play this move. Then you successfully destroy their center, and after knight takes d4, actually there is a way for black to win the game on the spot. And let this be our puzzle of the day. If you can find a winning idea for black, please write it down in comments below. Moving on to white defending their center with a c-pawn, pawn to c3. In this case, we're still going to trade on d4 because we want to destroy their central pawn chain. And after that, we're going to make use of the fact that with the absence of this pawn on the c-file, their queen side is a little bit weakened. Also, due to the fact that the bishop went out, leaving these squares undefended on the queen side. And we're going to strike where it hurts with the same move, queen to b6, attacking this pawn and somewhat putting pressure to the pawn on d4, even though right now that pawn is guarded by the white queen. Anyway, so far they need to deal with this threat of queen takes b2, which will attack the pawn, attack the rook. They gotta do something. There are a number of ways for white to defend this pawn, but they all are somewhat uncomfortable. And let's start with the most common one, pawn to b3. which looks like the easiest solution. And to some extent it is the easiest, but the downside is that it weakens even further all these black squares of the queen side, and we are gonna be merciless. We're gonna play knight c6, adding the second attack to this pawn on d4, and after white guards it, hoping for their London solid setup, we're gonna break open the center straight away with the move pawn a5. We're actually sacrificing the pawn because we want to bring our pieces into the attack as quickly as possible and to checkmate them while they are completely undeveloped. Now e5 attacks the bishop, so they gotta do something about this. If let's say they take or do anything else, you jump with their bishop out to b4, and now white starts seeing that all these weaknesses of dark squares of the queen side is actually a major problem, because there is no easy way for them to cover the king. For example, they can't bring their knight to the usual square c3, you'll just capture it. Now, instead they have to go knight to d2, but now the knight is pinned, and you can put more pressure with your own knight. Now the knight is still pinned, and it is attacked. They have to play knight f3, and now they barely hold on to this defense of this knight, but all you gotta do is to eliminate one of these pieces, and you can go g5. I mean, essentially want to eliminate this knight, which supports the other one on d2. So we go g5. And our idea is that we want to distract the knight, and if it distracts anywhere, you'll be free to capture the knight, check the king, and win the game. If they don't take there, and let's say they take with the bishop, I mean, you could already win a piece by trading on d2 first, and after that, grabbing the bishop on g5. But there is a way to be even more brutal. You can actually take knight takes c5, and you still want to distract this knight, and after that take on d2, but this time white is completely defenseless, because whatever they do, if they don't take on e5 themselves, then you are going to take it. You will either way eliminate the defender. So let's say they take, now you play bishop takes d2, check. Your bishop is supported, they can't take it, so they have to put the king to this vulnerable and awkward square e2. And at this point, you could already play knight c3 with the royal fork and win the game, but Stockfish says that you can actually be completely brutal. You can just go d5 and say, hey, you know what, you have nothing to do. Because white is indeed quite stuck. Their king is in the middle of the board, really awkward, they can't develop, still all kinds of threats are around the king, and white has nothing to do. In most cases they play f3, kind of pushing you into the royal fork, which you were going to play anyway. So you go knight c3, now you're kind enough to grab their queen, so on the next move you do that. Now after they finalize this trade, you can also then continue with pawn f6, yet another attacking move, grabbing one more piece of white, and white is completely destroyed. You end up with an extra queen. I do understand that these lines may feel complicated and you may not be sure that you're capable of remembering all them, and actually I do not recommend that you try to memorize them. Much rather, I'd wish you to understand the logic behind these moves so that it's easy for you to find them on your own. Moreover, I've got a dedicated masterclass where I break it down how to find attacking moves in any position easily. What is the exact process that I use in my own games? And if you're curious, you can click the link below this video in the description and attend this free masterclass. The second trap is one of my favorite. I used it multiple times successfully. After you've just played queen to b6, we already know that b3 actually weakens a whole lot of dark squares on the queen side, and there is a payoff for that. Now, some of your opponents will play queen c2, and actually this move is slightly tricky, because you certainly do not want to grab this undefended pawn on d4, that would be a big blunder. In this case, they would happily grab your bishop on c8 and checkmate you right away. Now, of course, it's easy to prevent this, you just don't need to blunder the bishop. You go knight c6, attacking this pawn on d4. This time the bishop is guarded by the rook, therefore we do not have to worry about it. There seems to be some earthquake that happened to my chessboard. I don't know what's that. Anyway, let's continue. Either way, white needs to guard this pawn. So they play pawn e3, and we're going to continue in a similar style. We're playing pawn d6, preparing the central breakthrough with pawn e5, hitting the bishop as well as the pawn. We want to completely break open the center and attack them. Now, they naturally try to stop this by going knight f3, hoping that they have 3 attackers to this square, and therefore you're unable to play e5, but you do that anyways. You strike in the center with pawn e5, and at first your opponent feels like you miscalculated, because after they trade, they start calculating, okay, I'm gonna take right here, here it takes, I take, I'm a pawn up, and they're happy. But here's how you break their mood. You play queen a5. Now, this time, it's a double attack to the king and a knight. Therefore, as their king is in check, they have to cover it somehow. After that, you're going to play knight takes e5, and thanks to this queen, you are going to be up a piece. Now, after they realize it, They start calculating, start thinking, and then they come up with a solution. They play queen c3, thinking, aha, now after we trade queens, I'm going to be still up a pawn because I grabbed it on e5. But once again, you frustrate them with bishop b4, pinning the queen, and yeah, they saved the knight, but they lost the queen. Another way that your opponents are going to use to guard the pawn on b2 is the move queen d2. Now, your moves are going to be the same. We still play knight c6 first, attacking this pawn, and after they defend it, we're going to use the disadvantage of queen standing there, and it's the fact that you can jump with your knight forward and gain a tempo attacking the queen. Now, the queen still needs to maintain the defense of this pawn, so they play queen c2, hoping that it gives them a tempo because they attacked your knight. But in reality, there is a really cool way for you to turn things around and to win the game within a couple moves. I'll give you a few seconds, you may try to find it on your own, and then I'll show you the way. Meanwhile, let me also share real quick that I've just started my Instagram account. It's gm.igorsmirnov, and therefore if you use Instagram at all, you can find me there, we can be friends, and there I can share some quick helpful tips, whether it be some short cool opening trap or a short piece of advice about chess improvement, and of course I can share some stuff that does not fit the YouTube format, where it's photos or like images and other stuff like that. So I'll drop a link below in the description as well, and we can be friends on Instagram. The winning move for black here is knight to b4. We attack the queen and we actually provoke them to grab our undefended knight on e4, but it was not a blunder because we continue with pawn to d5. Now the pawn is guarded, therefore they have to move the queen away, but there are no good squares for the queen to go to because these two squares are already controlled by our knight. The square on f5 is controlled by our bishop, therefore they have to move their queen elsewhere, but if they do so, now we've got this juicy fork to the king and rook, and that's how we win the game. After the king moves somewhere, you then grab the rook, getting the material advantage, plus their king is now exposed, and they still, as always, have to deal with this threat of queen takes b2, they still could not solve it, and their position is destroyed once again. Now, finally, let me address the elephant in the room. You may be wondering, what if white simply grabs this pawn on c5? What should I do then? Well, actually, white cannot win the pawn really, because this pawn can be easily got back by you within a couple of moves. You can play e6, or even simpler, you can go knight a6 and recapture the pawn that way. From a6, our knight controls this square as well, so they cannot guard it. You would then just grab this pawn. Therefore, they have to play any move after this. You get back this pawn on c5, and the position is completely equal, but for the most part, you just destroy their London system setup, and therefore, they're clueless, and even if you don't know any theory, I mean, still, it's very easy to play for black. Some of your opponents also may wish to grab the space in the middle of the board and to play pawn d5. To this, I like the response pawn b5. What it does is it takes away the square c4 so that it's harder for them to play c4 themselves and support this pawn on d5. Plus, it's harder for them to develop their knight to an active square because then you'll always play b4 and just push it away. Therefore, they have to come up with something else. The most played move by white here is pawn a3. They try to, attack this pawn on b5, but you just ignore it and you play bishop b7. That is another little bit of a hidden idea behind this move pawn b5. You want to attack this advanced pawn, which is far away from the rest of their army, and there is no convenient way to defend it once again, because if they ever try and add c3, just play b4, right? It has to go. But they think, okay, no problem, we're just gonna trade. They take this pawn, now you take this pawn on d5, and you also attack the bishop on f4. Now they try to drop it back, and that is actually already a blunder. You play queen a5, and all of a sudden, that is a double attack to the king and bishop. Also, they cannot play knight c3 and guard the bishop that way, because you've got this handy knight on d5. You can just trade off, attack the queen, and then you grab this bishop, and you're up a piece with a totally winning position. Sometimes people tell me, Igor, it's all cool, but I usually play the queen's gambit, and I worry that if I go for knight f6, what if they don't play the London system? What if they play something else, and I don't know what to do? Well, first of all, you can actually transpose it back into the queen's gambit. So if they, let's say, play c4, and they want to play the traditional queen's gambit, and you don't mind, you can go e6 and then continue with d5, and you transposed it back into the queen's gambit. So that is one thing that you can do. An alternative is actually to play the Nimzo-Indian defense, bishop to b4. And recently I recorded a video showing you a very simple and aggressive setup, which you can learn easily without going too much in depth into all the potential sublines of the Nimzo-Indian. It's a cool system. I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy it. So if you're interested, you can click the link right there and check the video.